Chapter 13. Telltale Prince. For a moment Nancy stood, paralyzed with fear. Then she roused herself to action and began shouting, "Stop! Stop!" at the top of her lungs. She had no idea where to find the switch for the houseboat's running lights, but darted back inside. She at least turned on the cabin lights and also snatched up her handbag. George and Bess had already been awakened by Nancy's loud cries. Bewildered, but realizing that some sort of emergency had arisen, they both jumped out of bed, wriggling into their robes and following her out on deck. The sight of the oncoming cruiser shocked them wide awake. Nancy plucked a small flashlight from her bag and began shining its beam back and forth. The other girls joined in frantic shouts. Just in the nick of time, the high, white prow of the cruiser veered away. Presently, an angry male voice came bellowing through an electric bullhorn at the three trembling girls.
"What are you doing on the river without lights?"
As the other craft maneuvered into position alongside the houseboat, Nancy was able to explain that they had been securely moored at the riverside marina, but that somehow the boat had come drift during the night. The cruiser skipper, by now sympathetic and concerned over the girls' plight, offered to tow them back to the marina if they would throw him their tow line. George hurried over to the hull to haul it from the water under the cruiser's powerful searchlight. Nancy saw her gasp and frowned when the end of the rope was in her hand. "What's wrong, George? See for yourself, Nancy." The end of the rope had been cleanly and freshly cut. "We didn't just come adrift," George went on, their mutual thought into words. "Someone cut us loose from our mooring." Bess was nervous and shaken by this discovery, but Nancy tried to allay her fears. "Never mind. We can worry about that later," she smoothed. "The most important thing right now is getting back to the marina." George tossed the line to the waiting cruiser captain, and he promptly took them in tow. Within an hour, the girls were back safe and sound in their slip at the marina. After thanking their rescuer emotionally, they lost no time in crawling back into their bunks, and all three were soon sinking into an exhausted slumber. The next morning the girls slept late. Then, after a light breakfast, Nancy dropped Bess and George at their homes and drove on to her own house. "Nancy, your dad called about an hour ago," Hannah Gruen greeted her. "He's going to be in court the rest of the day, so he asked me to tell you that he's talked to Mr. Trimble, and you're to call him when you get the chance." "Mr. Trimble or Dad?" As she spoke, the housekeeper took Nancy's overnight bag and handed her a slip of paper bearing the lawyer's phone number. "Okay, Hannah, thanks." Nancy went to the front hall telephone and dialed the number. When Hannah returned a few moments later, she was just hanging up. "Well, I'm off to lunch with Mr. Trimble," the teenager reported. "It's the only time he can see me, so I'll just have time to change." 10 crowded minutes later, she was on her way to La Croix d'Argent, the restaurant where she had arranged to meet the attorney. I hope he's going to pick up the check, 'cause That sounds like a fancy place. As she entered, Nancy was greeted by the dark-eyed head waiter with a waxed mustache. Mademoiselle Drew, Monsieur Trimble is waiting for you. Come this way, please. He showed her to a table occupied by an elderly man with a mane of white hair. So you're Carson Drew's daughter. The lawyer stood up with a smile and shook hands with the young sleuth. I'm so grateful to you for seeing me on such short notice. Nancy dimpled. Not at all, Oh. I'm very grateful to you for seeing me on such short notice. Nancy dimpled. Not at all, my dear. I don't often have a chance to lunch with a lovely young lady. After they had ordered, Mr. Trimble said, Now how can I help you, Miss Drew? I understand you were Mr. John Trent's lawyer. Could you tell me about him? John asked. Well, there's not much to tell, really. John Trent was a self-made man. He started from scratch, opened up his own small machine shop, and built it into a major machine tool company, and made a fortune while doing so, I might add. Do you know much about his background or his past? Not a great deal. I gathered from various remarks he made over the years that he came from a poor background, and he certainly adored his only child, Joy, a lovely girl, by the way. Fred Trimble paused to offer Nancy a roll, then went on. Never spoke about his wife, you see. Apparently her death must have been a bitter blow. I do know that during most of the time I served as his personal attorney, he employed babysitters and housekeepers to care for Joy, and then recently his widowed sister, Selina Yanali, came to live with them to help out. He fell silent while the white-coated waiter served their eggs Benedict. Once they were eating, Nancy said, Joy mentioned something about her Aunt Selma being only her temporary guardian. The lawyer cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. Yes, well, my client was concerned that Joy might not be too happy under her aunt's guardianship, so he specified privately in his will that under certain circumstances other arrangements might be worked out. You mean a different guardian might be appointed? Ahem. Once again, Mr. Trimble looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Miss Drew, but I'm not at liberty to discuss that subject. Joy is 17 now. I can only tell you that when she reaches the age of 21, she will come into her father's fortune. Until then, it will remain in trust under the control of myself, as the executor of his estate, and her guardian, who at present is Mrs. Yalty. As she enjoyed her eggs Benedict, Nancy sat thinking of Mr. Trimble's phrase. Under certain circumstances. The question was, what circumstances? Only one thing seemed clear. Nancy reflected. John Trent must have sensed instinctively that his sister, Selina Yalty, was not the ideal guardian for his beloved daughter, Joy. The young detective and the elderly attorney finished their delicious meal while chatting pleasantly about various subjects. Thank you for a lovely lunch, Mr. Trimble, Nancy said as they parted. The pleasure was all mine, Miss Drew, I assure you. Nancy decided to call Joy Trent to arrange another visit that afternoon. But on her way to the Trent house, she stopped at the police headquarters to speak to Chief McGinnis. "Nancy, I was just going to call you," the chief declared as she walked into his office. "I just had a report from the fingerprint lab about that stolen boat." "They found the prints on the boat of the boat thieves?" Nancy inquired hopefully. "That's right, and believe it or not, they belong to Fingers Malone and Baldy Krebs." Actually, that makes a lot of sense. "Our boys matched them with a complete set of prints Detective Norris brought us from the St. Louis Police Department." "Oh, wow," Nancy said, excited. This news strongly suggested that Fingers and Baldy were the two dark figures whom she and Ned had seen on the carousel Monday night, and that they had made their getaway by stealing the boat, as she had already guessed. But why were they so interested in the carousel? After pondering for several moments, Nancy said, "Chief, is Detective Norris still in River Heights?" "Yes. He's still keeping watch for those two crooks at Riverside Park." "Is there any way I could reach him?" "Sure, no problem." McGinnis promptly had a radio call sent out to the park policeman. Officer Doyle asking him to have Detective Norris phoned police headquarters. Within a few minutes, the telephone rang Chief McGinnis' desk. On Chief McGinnis' desk, Detective Norris was on the line. After acknowledging the call, McGinnis handed the phone to Nancy. "Nancy Drew here," she said. "I'd like to ask you a question, Detective Norris. You told me Fingers Malone was almost caught at the park in St. Louis, but got away when Baldy Krebs wounded the arrested officer. Did that by any chance happen at an amusement park, or was it just an ordinary public park?" "No, an amusement park, Miss Drew." With a growing feeling of excitement, Nancy continued, "Did either of them have any previous connection with amusement parks? I mean, for example, is that where Fingers was usually operated as a pickpocket?" "Funny you should ask," Norris replied. As a matter of fact, Fingers Malone was caught in that same amusement park just before he was sent to prison. You remember I told you he'd served 20 years of his 25-year sentence just before he broke out and became a fugitive? Well, it was really on account of that amusement park that he got sent up in the first place. I'll tell you how it happened. Norris explained that at the time, Fingers was being hunted for his part in a serious gangland crime, quite different from his usual specialty of pickpockets. But he had gone into hiding and could not be found. Then, one night on a pro-monument St. Louis business, a jeweler got his pockets picked while he was at the park with his family. He was sore as the dickens and raised the roof down at headquarters. As a result, the chief of the Bonko squad assigned an extra detail of detectives to patrol the park. And on the second night there, one of them spotted Fingers with his hands in a lady's purse and nabbed him right in the act. Detective Norris chuckled dryly over the phone and added, "Turned out Fingers had been laying low and working as a carny there in the amusement park while he waited for the heat to cool down. But he couldn't resist the temptation. Those expert fingers of his turned out to be his downfall. After thanking both Detective Norris and Police Chief McGinnis, Nancy drove on to Joy's house in an optimistic frame of mind. Joy herself opened the door.
I saw you coming up the drive, Nancy. I'm so glad you came.
I thought we might need to rack our brains a little more over your father's puzzle, Nancy said with a smile.
Oh, great! I'm just in the mood.
On entering the spacious front room, Nancy saw Joy's Aunt Selma seated in front of the television set, watching an afternoon soap opera.
Oh, good afternoon, Miss Yawley, she said politely.
The woman looked up and nodded coldly. She nodded coldly. Joy took Nancy on through the house to her father's study. No sooner had she closed the door behind them than she whirled around, eager to face the visitor.
Nancy, do you think I should get in touch with Mrs. Harrod, even though Aunt Selma forbids it?
Nancy replies calmly, I think you should be guided by your own conscience, Joy. A relieved smile came over the red-haired girl's face, and she clapped her hands.
Then I'm going to do it.
She started toward the phone, only to stop short a moment before lifting the receiver.
No. On second thought, I won't do it right now. Aunt
Selma might listen in on the extension, and it would be just like her to make an unpleasant fuss. I'll call later when she's out. Meanwhile, Nancy had already begun drifting about the room, looking for iris clues and scrutinizing the many colorful objects with which Joy Trent had decorated his study. Suddenly, Nancy snapped her fingers and exclaimed excitedly, Joy, I think I may have found part of the answer. Chapter 14. A Trail of Clues.
What is it, Nancy?
Said Joy, flashing her an eager look. What have you found? Her own eyes followed the direction of Nancy's gaze. The young detective was staring at a wall painting of the Civil War battle scene. It showed a line of blue-coated Union soldiers charging into the smoke and gunfire of the Confederate redoubt. Look there, Joy. Nancy pointed to two of the figures in the painting. One, the Union color sergeant, had evidently just been hit by an enemy bullet. As he fell, a companion was snatching the flag from the dying sergeant's hand.
Look at what?
Joy's face took on a puzzled frown. I mean, I see what you're pointing at, but so what? That's an American flag. Old Glory.
Oh, yes! Of course!
But Joy's voice trailed off uncertainly, and she still looked puzzled. The flag was rather small in the picture, and its bright stars and stripes were dimmed by the gun smoke, so that did not readily strike the eye at first glance. Nancy realized that she must have noticed it the first time she inspected the room, even though the
impression had merely glimmered in the back of her mind, and she had been unable to bring it into clear focus. But now the flag's significance seemed obvious. Notice where the flagstaff is pointing? As she spoke, Nancy's finger traced an invisible line from the spear point at the tip of the flagstaff across the painted canvas to out beyond the edge of the picture frame. The line pointed straight toward a single iris in a slender glass vase, standing on a shelf close by. "Oh!" Joy caught her breath with excitement as she realized what Nancy was getting at. "Iris and Old Glory, just like in the riddle in Daddy's letter." And you did tell me, didn't you, that all the fresh irises in the house are replaced daily by your father's standing order? Yes, that's right! So this must be what his riddle refers to, because he knew there'd always be an iris in that vase for the flag to point at. Nancy nodded thoughtfully. "It certainly seems more than a coincidence," she mused aloud. "But we still don't know what the question mark in the riddle stands for. Isn't that where the answer goes?" Just a thought. She was silent for several moments, then turned to her red-haired friend. "Those words, Iris and Old Glory, what do they suggest to you, Joy? Anything at all?" Joy wrinkled her forehead and shrugged. "Not really." "Well, wait a minute. They do remind me of something." "Such as?" Nancy inquired keenly. "That carousel horse I told you about. When Daddy first bought him for me as a birthday present, I named him Glory, because he was so beautiful, and sometimes in those days when I'd talked to him, I'd referred to him as Old Glory." Joy flashed a rueful smile. "But I guess that doesn't help much, does it?" You never know. You said you lent your horse to the River Heights Daycare Center?" "That's right. Would you like to see it?" "Very much," declared Nancy. "Let's try to drive over there right now, Joy." "Let's drive over there right now, Joy." "Okay, suits me." The daycare center was located in a big old house not far from Riverside in what had once been a neighborhood of aristocratic mansions. Two other houses in the same block were now empty, and according to the builder's sign, were soon to be torn down to make way for an elevated parking garage, leaving the center as the only accompanied site. Its grounds were overgrown with shrubbery and shaded by tall, ancient oaks and hemlocks. Despite these rather gloomy surroundings, however, the house itself had a cheerful air and bustled with the sounds and laughter of children at play. It was staffed by volunteer members, one of whom, a Miss Blambish, greeted the two visitors cordially. "The children are just about to have their afternoon nap," she informed Joy, "so you and Nancy will be able to look over your hobby horse undisturbed." The horse stood near a big, maligned window in what once had evidently been the mansion's game room.
With its raised, prancing foreleg, arched neck, and flying mane, the carousel steed looked incredibly lifelike. Its flaring pink nostrils, firing eyes, and glossy dapple gray coat all added to the vivid impression, and its feathered bridle and gilded trappings seemed to make it a truly royal charger. "Oh, how beautiful!" Nancy murmured, softly gazing at the horse in the wide-eyed admiration. "Now you can see why I fell in love with him when I was a little girl," said Joy, obviously pleased by her reaction. "Would you like to ride him?" Nancy giggled. "Is anyone watching?" "What's the drift? Go on." Nancy, who was wearing jeans, put one foot in the stirrup and swung herself gracefully into the saddle. As she began to post up and down on the spring-mounted hobby horse, the music box mechanism in the stand tingled out a gay, lively rendition of Yankee Doodle. "Oh, hey, this is great!" Nancy exclaimed. Joy watched merrily. "Something tells me you're an expert horsewoman, Nancy. I've ridden in a few shows." Chuckling, she added, "If I had a horse like Glory at home, I'd probably have no time for detecting." The ride and the tune ended with both girls convulsing in a fit of laughter as Nancy dismounted. Even while galloping to the music, she had been aware of the fine details of the horse's carving, and now that she was out of the saddle and on her feet again, she could appreciate the workmanship even more. "You know, Joy," she mused, with one finger to her lips as she gazed at the lovely steed, "Glory is not one of the original carousel horses. It's carved in a much more realistic and lifelike style." "Well, I always knew it was more beautiful than the other horses on the merry-go-round," Joy said proudly, "but I'm not sure I ever noticed it was of different workmanship. Why? Does that have some connection with Daddy's riddle?" "Not necessarily, but it does mean the carousel operator lied to me for some reason." Nancy explained how Leo Novak had told her the lead horse had been replaced twice, once when Joy's father bought Glory, and again when the replacement horse was damaged by a park truck. But if Glory, too, was not one of the original carousel steeds, then the lead horse must have been replaced 3 times. Another thought intrigued and excited Nancy. When Finkers Malone and Baldy Kreps were sneakily examining the carousel horses on Monday night after the park closed, could Glory have been the one they were looking for? Also, the burglars who broke into the Trent's house had taken nothing. Was this because of the arrival of the police car scared them off? Or could it be they had been looking for Joy's carousel horse, but failed to find it because it was at the daycare center? Nancy realized that if her theorizing was right, then Glory must be valuable for some reason. But why? Nancy was still deep in thought as she and Joy walked away down the flagstone path leading from the old house to the street, so deeply absorbed in the fact that she stumbled and almost fell. "Oh, Nancy, dear!" cried Joy, catching her friend by the right arm. "Are you all right?" Yes, thanks. Just stubbed my toe, Nancy said ruefully. Looking down, she saw that one of the ancient flags had tilted unevenly, so that a corner of it protruded above the ground, and this was what had caught her foot. A startled expression came over Nancy's face as another excited hunch flashed through her mind. Joy, I've just thought of something, she cried. Let's go back to your house, right away. As she drove through the afternoon traffic, Joy listened eagerly to Nancy's idea. Are you aware, the girl sleuth inquired, that the flower called iris also has another name? Joy nodded. Of course, some people call them flags. As she uttered the last word, Joy caught on with a smile to Nancy's trend of thought. Oh, is that what gave you your sudden inspiration when you stumbled back there? Right. And by the way, have you ever had algebra in school, Joy? Yes, though I must admit I'm no genius at math. Why? Because if you think of your father's message as a mathematical equation, it makes sense. It does? Joy wrinkled her forehead. I'm not so sure I follow. Well, maybe I should have said it makes sense if you substitute the word flag for the question mark, because Old Glory is also a flag, Nancy explained. In other words, the message would read, Iris equals flag equals Old Glory. Of course, I get it now, Joy exclaimed. Oh, Nancy, how brilliant of you! So a flag must be the answer to Daddy's riddle. Exactly. I suspect the place to look for whatever flag he's referring to is right there in his study. Minutes later, the two girls were hurrying into John Trent's study. Almost at once, Nancy's attention fastened to a metal statuette. It portrayed an old-time Western cavalry of Indian fighting days. He was mounted on horseback and carrying a banner in one hand. The statuette, Nancy noticed, was a bronze casting, but evidently the banner had been separately crafted. Its slender staff, which, though rigid, was not much thicker than the stout wire, passed through an opening in the rider's hand. Its lower end fitted into a socket on his saddle. Nancy cautiously fingered the flagstaff. Despite its snug fit, she noticed that it could be jiggled slightly. Oh! Joy gasped, looking on in wide-eyed suspense. Do you think that's the flag Daddy meant? We'll soon find out, Nancy protested. She tugged on the flagstaff, pulling it upward through the hole in the rider's hand. As the staff came loose from its saddle socket, something else came out with it. Joy snatched the object excitedly. It was a tiny wad of fine tissue paper. Both girls held their breath as Joy uncrumpled and smoothed out the tissue. It bore a crude drawing of a horse with a frog riding on its back. 15. The yesterday message. Another riddle, Joy explained. What on earth does it mean? A frog on a horse, Nancy murmured pensively. Then she shook her head. I'm afraid I don't know either, Joy. But the drawing must mean something, or your father wouldn't have left it here for you to find. I'm sure we can decipher it if we put our heads together and think. In the meantime, the statuette itself, the bronze likeness of a Western cavalry, had started a brand new train of thought in Nancy's mind. There's another lead on the carousel mystery that I want to check out this afternoon, Joy. She went on. I'll let you know as soon as I have anything to report. From the Trent's house, Nancy drove to the River Heights Public Library. Ooh. There she looked up the name Walter Cruz in the catalog file. Several books were listed about famous Western artists and his works. And Nancy was able to find one of them on the shelves. It was entitled The Art of Walter Cruz. She took her find to the table near the window and began leafing through its pages. As she studied the reproductions in color of Cruz's paintings and sculptures, she grew more and more excited. So my hunch was right, she murmured under her breath. Now I'm sure of it. After returning the book to its place on the shelf, Nancy went to the pay telephone in the library's front lobby and called the director of the River Heights Art Museum, who was an old friend. They spoke for several minutes when then she hung up and called reporter Rick Jason at the news. Hi, Nancy, he said. How are you coming on the carousel mystery? I think I'm getting close to the solution, but I need your help. Would you do me a favor? Just name it. Nancy told him about Joy Trent's carousel horse at the daycare and asked if he could arrange to have a picture story about it appearing in the evening paper. I know it's late to be asking, she added apologetically, but this is really important. It may pay off in quite a news scoop if I do succeed in solving the mystery. Okay, we're almost ready to go to press, so we may have to remake a couple of pages to fit it in, but that's no great problem. I'll talk to the editor and get a photographer on the job pronto. Another thing, Nancy went on hastily. Could your editor possibly use his influence with the television news people to get a similar story broadcast on tonight's news? You know, about how a horse from the haunted carousel has turned up at the local daycare center. One can but try, Rick Jason replied. If I can pass the word that it may help Nancy Drews of the carousel mystery, I think they'll probably go along. But remember, I get the scoop. The teenage sleuth chuckled. That's a promise. And thanks a million for your help. Hanging up, Nancy hurried out of the library to her car and headed for Bess Marvin's house. Bess told her that Ned Nickerson had been trying to reach her. Okay, thanks, Bess. I'll call him, Nancy responded. But first, how would you like to help me out on a little detective work at the park? Bess's blue eyes lit up with suppressed excitement. Need you ask? I mean, well, providing it's not too dangerous. Nancy dimpled. Don't worry. No more crooks chases. At least, not if I can help it. She had explained hastily that she had in mind what she had in mind. Then she called Ned to arrange to meet him at Riverside Park. Moments later, the two girls were whizzing there in Nancy's trim blue sports car. On arriving, Nancy stayed behind in the car. According to their prearranged plan, while Bess made her way on foot to the carousel, there she stopped and began watching the merry-go-round revolve gaily with its riders, as if she were waiting for someone. Every few minutes she would walk about restlessly and take up a new position, just to make sure the operator noticed her. Leo Novak had seen Bess Marvin before, and soon recognized her as Nancy Drew's chum. "Waiting for your friend?" he asked pleasantly.
"Yes, for Nancy Drew."
Bess pretended to be in a chatty mood and began boasting about Nancy's many successes as a sleuth.
"Incidentally, I guess you won't have to worry anymore about the carousel being haunted."
"Oh, no?" Novak tilted an eyebrow. "How come?"
"Well, this is off the record, you understand, but Nancy told me she found a hobby horse at the River Heights Daycare Center, which originally came off of the Wonderland Gala."
"Is that so? One of the Ojan's old carousel horses, huh?" Novak's expression took on a shrewd frown as he added, "What's that got to do with the haunting, though?"
Bess shrugged her plump shoulders. "Search me, but that's what Nancy told me. I believe she thinks that whoever was playing such a prank on you was really searching for that horse. And now that it's turned up, the prank won't be necessary anymore. If there's no more haunting, she says, that will prove her theory's correct."
Novak grunted in a way that sounded as if he was not convinced. "Sounds pretty far out to me." Several minutes later, Nancy came walking toward the merry-go-round to join Bess. On seeing Nancy, the carousel operator said, "Your girlfriend's telling me you figured out why my carousel plays at night." Nancy smiled politely.
"Well, let's just say I have a theory about it."
"She also claims there won't be any more of this spooky business."
"Only if my theory's right."
Leo Novak continued to ply Nancy with questions, obviously fishing for more information, but she fended them off with a few teasing remarks. Then Nancy turned to her chum. "Come on, Bess. It's past 5. We better be getting back to the car." The two girls walked off. Novak stared after them with an irritating look of frustration. Ned Nickerson was waiting beside Nancy's blue sports car. When she and Bess reached the parking lot, "Still hard at work on the mystery trail?"